The rain over Detroit came down sideways that Thursday night, turning the neon reflections on Gratiot Avenue into long, bleeding smears of red and gold against the black asphalt. Inside Maggie's round-the-clock diner on the corner of East Warren, the air was a thick cocktail of burned toast, dish soap, and the specific, exhausted sadness of a place that had never once closed its doors. Nora Blake didn't mind the smell anymore. She barely registered it. She was 29 years old. Running on 4 hours of sleep and 2 cups of gas station coffee, she'd drank cold in the employee bathroom during her half-hour break. She was a size 22, with wide hips that ached after a 12-hour double, thick thighs that rubbed raw against her polyester uniform by hour 9, and a round, full-cheeked face framed by a loose bun of dark chestnut hair that had migrated somewhere south of her ear by 11 p.m. She wasn't invisible in the way thin women sometimes described feeling invisible. She was invisible, the way a piece of furniture is invisible seen, used, and never actually looked at. She had learned to be fine with that. Fine was safe. Safe meant she could work her shifts, pocket her tips, and keep chipping away at the $63,000 of hospital debt her father had left behind when the dialysis machine stopped working last March at Beaumont Hospital. Fine was a strategy. Fine kept the lights on at 12:15 inches the morning. The diner was down to its last dregs, a truck driver nursing a decaf at the counter, an insomniac grandmother working a crossword in booth 7, and the teenage cook, Darius, who was already scrubbing the grill in anticipation of last call. Then the front door opened. The cold didn't just come in with him. It replaced the air. 3 men walked through the door. The 2 flanking him were the kind of large that made structural engineers nervous, their eyes executing slow, professional sweeps of every corner of the room. But the man in the center was the kind of presence that registered in your sternum before your eyes caught up. Nora had never met Dominic Ferraro, but she recognized him the same way you recognize a thunderstorm before it hits. By the way, everything around it goes quiet. He was the head of the Ferraro organization, Detroit's legitimate face of construction, port logistics, and commercial real estate, sat on top of a criminal infrastructure so entrenched it had outlasted 4 mayoral administrations and 2 FBI task forces. He was tall, dark-haired, with a jaw like something carved from a ship's hull and eyes, the particular shade of gray that made you think of deep water in winter. His suit was charcoal, bespoke, and effortless, in the way that things are only effortless when they cost more than a car. Darius, behind the grill, very carefully set down his scrubbing brush and stared at the middle distance. Dominic Ferraro walked directly to Nora's section and slid into the corner booth by the rain-streaked window. His men took up positions at the door and by the emergency exit. He folded his hands on the table and waited. Nora grabbed a mug and the coffee pot. She was too tired to be afraid, and her left foot had gone partially numb somewhere around the 9th hour of her shift, which made the fear feel like an abstract concern compared to the very immediate problem of whether she could make it through another hour without sitting down. She walked over, flipped his mug right side up, and filled it without being asked. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had already said the word approximately 400 times that day. "Kitchen's calling it in 15 minutes. If you want a hot plate, now's the time." Dominic looked up from his coffee. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Barely a millimeter. But it was the look of a man who had just encountered something he didn't have a category for. Women. in Dominic Ferraro's experience, reacted to him in one of two modes: the predatory warmth of those who wanted something he had, or the brittle, barely contained terror of those who had heard enough to know what he was. Nora Blake looked at him the way she would look at any customer who hadn't decided yet, with mild, professional impatience. "Just the coffee," he said. His voice was low, a resonant baritone that seemed to cost nothing and fill the room completely. "And your name?" "Nora." She tucked the coffee pot against her hip. "If you're just drinking, I'm going to need this booth back. Parties of one get the counter stools." One of the men by the door made a sound that wasn't quite a cough and wasn't quite a laugh. Dominic tilted his head. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across his mouth. "Is that the policy?" "That's the policy." Nora confirmed. "Counter. Or order something off the dessert menu. We've got peach cobbler and chocolate cream pie tonight." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't flinch. She was recalculating how many creamers needed to be restocked. "Bring me the pie," he said. She came back with a slice of chocolate cream pie, set it in front of him, and turned to go. "Actually," Dominic said, his voice dropping to something quieter, something that wasn't meant for the room. "Sit down. I'm working. I'll pay for your time." Nora turned back around. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not that kind of waitress," she said. And her voice was not sharp, it was just factual. The way you'd tell someone the pie was $7. She pulled the check from her apron, set it on the table without being asked, and walked back toward the kitchen. That was the first rejection. She half expected to be fired in the morning. She went home on the bus, soaked through her jacket, and let herself into her studio apartment on Mac Avenue. She microwaved leftover rice, stared at a final notice from a collections agency, and fell asleep before 11. Nothing happened. For 3 weeks. Nothing happened. The debt collectors kept calling. The double shifts kept coming. Nora kept going. Then, on a Tuesday, a delivery arrived. 24 long-stemmed birds of paradise. Not roses. Not lilies. But birds of paradise. The kind that sold for $40 a stem at the florist near the Eastern Market. The arrangement was the size of a small child and smelled expensive. No card, Nora knew. She put them in the break room with a note that said free. A first come, first served, and didn't think about it again. Or she tried not to. The following Friday, the diner's landlord, a petty, perpetually aggrieved man named Gerald, who had been threatening to raise Maggie's rent for 6 consecutive months, came in and told Maggie, the 72-year-old owner, that he had reconsidered. Not only would the rent not increase, the next 18 months were, apparently, prepaid in full by a third-party real estate holding company. Maggie cried. She hugged Nora. She had no idea why. Nora had every idea why. The real escalation came on a Thursday evening. Nora arrived home to find a man. She recognized one of the mountains from the diner, standing at her mailbox on the front stoop of her building. "Miss Blake," the man said, with the particular awkward formality of someone very large, trying to seem unthreatening. "Mr. Ferraro wanted you to know that the balance on your father's Beaumont account has been cleared. He also asked me to give you this." He held out a matte black envelope. Nora felt a hot, clean spike of fury go straight through her chest. She took the envelope, opened it, and found a key card stamped with the logo of the Meridian Ferraro's members-only lounge in Midtown, housed on the 32nd floor of a building he owned. and that had a 6-month waiting list for anyone with a name he didn't already know. She did not go upstairs. She walked to the bus stop in the rain, took the 4 all the way to Midtown, and arrived at the Meridian soaking wet with her shoes leaving small dark puddles on the marble lobby floor, the security staff at the elevator enormous. Impeccable. Expressionless, checked her keycard and stepped aside. Apparently she had clearance. The 32nd floor was everything. The diner was not. Low amber lighting. Soft jazz moving through the air, like something alive. The smell of aged bourbon and leather, and something faintly floral. Women in gowns. Men in suites. A floor-to-ceiling view of Detroit's skyline, glittering in the rain below like scattered embers. Dominic was at a private table near the west window, a glass of dark, amber liquid in hand, speaking with 2 men in hushed tones. He saw her the moment the elevator opened. He dismissed the 2 men with a word and a look. Nora crossed the room toward him. She was aware, in the periphery of her attention, that everyone in the room had turned to look at her, her wet uniform, her practical shoes, her full figure that occupied space in exactly the way she'd long since stopped apologizing for. She didn't slow down. "You paid off my father's debt," she said, stopping in front of his table. "I did, without asking me. You wouldn't have accepted it if I'd asked." "You're right," Nora said, "because I don't want it." She pulled the keycard from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. "I have spent my entire adult life being underestimated by people who looked at me and saw someone easy to manage. You bought my landlord. You bought my grief. You are trying to buy me, and I am not for sale." Dominic's expression didn't shift toward anger. It shifted toward something more unsettling, a kind of still, intent focus, as if she had just said something extraordinarily interesting. "You misread my—" "No," Nora said, cutting him off cleanly. "I didn't. And I'm telling you clearly, stop. Stop sending things to my workplace. Stop showing up in my life. Stop thinking that a woman like me is so desperate for someone to notice her that she'll overlook where the money comes from and what it costs." She picked up the keycard, put it back in his hand, and closed his fingers around it. "I'm not interested. Good night, Mr. Ferraro." She turned and walked back to the elevator. The room watched her go. That was the second rejection. What Nora didn't see, as she pushed through the lobby doors into the rain and started the long, cold walk toward the bus stop on Woodward, was the silver Cadillac parked at the far end of the block, engine idling. The man inside watching her through the rain-blurred windshield with an expression of clinical interest. His name was Sal Brancato. He ran the Brancato operation out of Warren Ferraro's oldest rival, the family that had been trying to take the Midtown territories for 11 years and had never quite managed it. Brancato had cultivated sources inside every organization in the city, and for the last 4 weeks, those sources had been feeding him increasingly interesting reports. Dominic Ferraro, it seemed, had developed an unusual attachment to a waitress from East Warren. In Brancato's experience, a man's unusual attachment was his most exploitable vulnerability. He had built half his operation on that principle. He picked up his phone and made a call. Nora had made it 2 blocks from the Meridian when the van pulled up. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. One moment she was walking in the rain. The next, a side door opened, and 2 men stepped out of the shadows between parked cars. She had time to register that they weren't wearing the kind of suits she associated with Ferraro's people. And then a hand closed over her mouth, and the rain disappeared. She woke up cold. The smell hit her first river water. Rust. And the specific damp of a building that had been abandoned long enough for the walls to start forgetting they'd been walls. A single work lamp on an orange extension cord hung from a crossbeam above her. She was zip-tied to a metal folding chair in the center of what appeared to be a former machine parts warehouse, somewhere near the river. Her head ached from the base of her skull forward. She touched the back of her head with her fingers and felt a knot the size of a golf ball. Sal Brancato stepped into the light. He was compact, silver-haired, wearing a tan overcoat that was entirely too nice for the location. 3 men stood behind him, armed with weapons that looked modified and illegal. He lit a cigarette and looked at her with the expression of someone evaluating a piece of second-hand furniture. "Nora Blake," he said. "Waitress. East Warren. Father deceased. March of this year. 63,000 in outstanding hospital debt, or, I should say, formerly outstanding. Ferraro cleared it 2 weeks ago." He exhaled. 47,000 square feet of prime midtown commercial space. Versus a waitress who's been on her feet for 12 hours. You want to tell me what he sees in you? Or should I just assume he's lost his mind? "Ultime," Nora said. Brancato found this funny. "You're going to help me acquire Ferraro's port access contracts. All of them. Every dock. Every warehouse. Every arrangement he has with the harbor master, signed over to my operation. All he has to do is make one phone call." "He won't," Nora said. Not because she believed Dominic cared about her. She had been very clear with herself about the unlikelihood of that, but because she was fairly certain a man who ran an organization like his did not respond to leverage the way Brancato appeared to believe he would. "I told him off twice in 4 weeks. He's not going to trade anything for me. A man who pays $63,000 in a dead man's hospital debt over a woman who keeps rejecting him." Brancato raised an eyebrow. "That's not indifference. Sweetheart, that's obsession." Nora opened her mouth to argue. And then the south wall of the warehouse came inward. It wasn't a door opening. The door ceased to exist. A percussive blast of shaped explosive detonated against the frame, and the entire steel structure buckled inward in a shriek of tearing metal, and a shockwave of pressure that knocked Brancato sideways and extinguished the work lamp. Total darkness. Then the kind of gunfire she had only ever heard in movies, and even then hadn't believed could be so fast and so methodical. 3 shots. Four. A shout that turned into a noise that wasn't human. Brancato fired twice at nothing, screaming something she couldn't make out over the ringing in her ears. Something warm and heavy settled over her shoulders. A hand came to the side of her head, pressing her face down against a chest that smelled of gunpowder and something expensive and copper. "Don't look up." The voice was low and close to her ear. "Close your eyes. I've got you." She knew the voice. A final shot. Silence. The specific silence that follows violence. Heavy and total and wrong. Emergency lighting stuttered to life along the floor. Jing. Orange tinted, casting long shadows. Nora raised her head. Brancato was on the floor. His men were on the floor. The warehouse smelled of cordite and cold water. Dominic Ferraro stood above her. His charcoal suit was ruined, concrete dust. A long dark smear across the shoulder. Something wet on the sleeve. She didn't look at directly. He was still breathing hard. A cut along his cheekbone bled freely, and his knuckles were split across 3 fingers. He had a tactical knife in his left hand. which he used to slice through the zip ties at her wrists in 2 clean strokes. The moment her hands came free, Nora's adrenaline collapsed. Her legs didn't hold. She started to go forward, and Dominic caught her without stumbling. Without hesitation, both arms around her, pulling her full weight against his chest as if it cost him nothing. He was shaking, not her. Him, the most controlled man she had ever encountered, was shaking. "Did they hurt you?" His voice was very quiet. "Tell me specifically. Did any of them touch you?" "No." He talked at me for a while. Nora heard her own voice from somewhere outside herself. "I told him you wouldn't trade anything for me. I told him you didn't care." A silence. "You were wrong," Dominic said. He carried her out of the warehouse into the rain, out into a street lined with black SUVs and men with earpieces and weapons, all of them watching the door, and put her in the back seat of the lead vehicle, without putting her down until he had to. They drove, not to the diner, not to her apartment on Mack Avenue. The convoy moved through the city and arrived at a residential tower on the riverfront, quiet, private. The kind of building that had no sign out front, because the people who lived there didn't need a sign. A private elevator. A penthouse that occupied the whole of the top floor. Walled entirely in glass, facing the river and the city. Furnished in dark wood and pale stone. Clean. Quiet. Enormous. Dominic set hair on a wide sofa. Disappeared. And returned with a first aid kit and a bowl of warm water. He stripped off his ruined jacket. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms marked with old scars and new bruises. He knelt on the floor in front of her and began, with extraordinary care, to clean the blood from the side of her face. Nora watched him. The contrast was almost too large to look at directly. An hour ago, this man had walked through a wall and killed people in the dark. Now, he was kneeling on his own floor, daubing antiseptic onto a cut on her cheekbone. His jaw tight with concentration. "I want to go home," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Your apartment isn't safe. Brancato had a crew watching your building. Dominic, you're staying here tonight." "That's not. I told you I'm not." She stopped. Started again. "I rejected you. Twice. I said no. Clearly. Both times. I am not a reward you won, because you showed up with guns. I don't care what you just did." Dominic sat back on his heels and looked at her. The cut on his face was still bleeding. He didn't appear to notice. "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because I wasn't there to collect anything." He said it simply, flatly. The way he said everything. "I was there because you were there, and you were in danger, and that is the only reason that mattered." Nora stared at him. "You don't even know me." "I know enough. You know that I make $9 an hour plus tips, and I refuse to let you buy me." "Yes." Something shifted in his expression. "Do you know how few people have ever refused me anything? That's your problem, not mine. I know that too." He stood, and the full height of him filled the room. He walked toward the door to the hallway, and for a moment, she thought he was leaving her there, just walking away. Instead, he stopped at the foyer. His hand rested on the heavy door. He turned the brass deadbolt. The click of it was loud in the quiet apartment. He turned around. "I'm not locking you in," he said. "I'm locking the rest of the world out. There's a difference." He reached into his pocket and placed the key on the edge of the kitchen counter, visible, accessible, clearly hers to take whenever she wanted. "I'm not going to apologize for paying your father's debt. I'm not going to apologize for the flowers or the rent. I did those things because I wanted to, not because I thought they'd buy you. I know they couldn't. He crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. The first time I walked into that diner, I came in, expecting to intimidate a room. You told me to move to a smaller table. The corner of his mouth moved. I have not been able to stop thinking about that for 41 days. Nora said nothing. I look at you, and I see someone who is working herself into the ground for a debt she didn't create, who stands her ground in front of men who could have her removed from the building, who cares more about her own self-respect than any leverage I could offer. He came toward her slowly, stopping a few feet away. I am surrounded by people who want something from me or are afraid of me. You want nothing from me, and you're not afraid. Do you understand how rare that is? Do you understand that I have never once, in my entire life, met a woman who sent back my money? Most people need money, Nora said. Her voice was careful. You need money. Dominic said. You needed it badly, and you still threw it back. He crouched down so they were eye to eye. I don't want a woman who folds when I push. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who fold. I want. He stopped. He looked at her, the way she had seen him. Look at the city from the window of his lounge. Measuring and wanting, both at once. You? He said. I want you. Specifically, because you are entirely yourself, with no performance and no apology. That is not a fetish. That is not pity. That is the only thing I have ever encountered that felt like it was actually real. The rain tapped against the glass walls. Detroit glittered below them in the dark. Nora looked at the key on the counter. She looked at the locked door. She looked at the man kneeling in front of her with someone else's blood drying on his sleeve and a cut on his face he hadn't addressed. You're bleeding, she said. I know. That needs to be cleaned. Probably. She picked up the antiseptic cloth he'd been using on her. She looked at the cut on his cheekbone. She reached out and, with the same practical efficiency she gave to everything she did, pressed the cloth against the wound. Dominic went very still. I'm not agreeing to anything, Nora said, carefully. I'm not your girlfriend. I'm not your prize. I am a waitress who is having a very strange night, and who is currently deciding whether to take that key and leave. I know, he said, but... She kept her eyes on what her hands were doing. You just walked through a wall for me. And I think she exhaled. I think that deserves at least one conversation. A real one. Where you talk to me like a person and not an acquisition. I can do that. And in the morning, I'm going back to the diner. I'll drive you. In something inconspicuous. The corner of his mouth moved again. Define inconspicuous. Something that doesn't require a fleet. I'll see what I can do. Nora lowered the cloth. The cut was clean. She looked at him. Really. Looked at him. Past the suit and the weight of who he was in this city. At the man underneath who had driven across Detroit in the rain with a tactical team because a waitress had been taken from a sidewalk. She had rejected him twice. She had meant it. Both times. She had been right to mean it. But the third time was different, because this time, there was no invitation, no offer, no transaction. Just a man who had locked the door against the rain and left the key where she could reach it, and was waiting, for the first time in his life, to be told what she wanted. Okay, Nora said. Talk. And Dominic Ferraro, the most feared man in Detroit, who had never had to ask for anything in his adult life, let out a slow breath and sat down across from her, and began. Outside, the rain continued. The city moved below them in its slow, enormous, indifferent way, and in the glass tower above it all, two people who had no business finding each other sat in the quiet of an improbable night and talked until the sky began to go grey at its edges. She hadn't meant to stay, but when the first light of morning came through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and she realized she had been talking for 4 hours about her father, about the debt, about the years of learning to be invisible, about what it felt like to have people look through you rather than at you, and that he had listened. All of it. Without once checking his phone or looking toward the door, she understood something she hadn't expected to understand. He hadn't locked her in. He had locked everything else out. And somewhere between the 2nd hour and the 4th, Nora Blake stopped planning her exit. The key was still on the counter. She knew exactly where it was. She left it there,